Every so often on this show, I get the easy version of my job. Put three absurdly smart people in a room, ask a few questions, and mostly get the hell out of the way. This happily is that episode, our season 4 capstone, and a bit of a departure in format. This time, we're not doing a narrated deep dive, no 5 voices stitched together, just a really fun conversation about the juiciest, trickiest, least settled questions in AI policy right now with people who actually know where the bodies are buried. I'm Jeff Wilser, longtime journalist, AI keynote speaker, and host of the AI Summit at Consensus. This is The People's AI, presented by the Vana Foundation, and I'm proud to partner with Vana to bring you this episode. Vana is supporting the creation of a new internet, one rooted in data sovereignty, user ownership, and data portability. Their mission is to create a decentralized data ecosystem where individuals, not corporations, govern their own data and share the value it creates. Learn more at vana.org. With me today is Abal of the aforementioned Vana Foundation, who thinks harder than just about anyone about who really owns the data that powers all of this. Sheila Warren, chair of the Advanced AI Society, who spent years in the rooms where tech policy actually gets made. And Justin Slaughter of Paradigm, a veteran of the SEC and the CFTC, who reads polling data for fun and actually brought some polling data today that should worry many of us. Here's a taste of what we get into. Why AI's popularity is falling off a cliff. At one point, it polls worse than Congress. Let that sink in. Whether AI should be regulated like utility, the way we treat water and power, a provocative idea that art has champions, the big open source question and debates, and how much China's cheap, fast models should scare folks in the US, and who, if anyone, gets paid when your data trains a machine. Then near the end, we get a bit off script in the best of ways. We get into US politics and AI and the left and the right. And Justin breaks some genuine news about a certain mayor of New York, Mamdani, and what he really thinks about AI. It's spicy, it's substantive, and nobody fully agreed, which is great, my favorite kind of conversation. So with that, let us get right into it. All right, we have an incredible panel here. Art, Justin, Sheila, welcome to the People's AI podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Good to be here. Let's start with a quick round of intros. Sheila, kick us off. What are you focused on, especially through the lens of AI and policy?
Yeah, thanks for asking and thanks for having me here. It's so fun to be back with this crew. I love you guys. This is going to be fun. I am currently the chair of something called the Advanced AI Society, which is a combination of a nonprofit and a membership organization that's looking at technical standards in AI security specifically. And I took that position in addition to a big portfolio of other boards and things I'm doing, some advising, some consulting, et cetera, everything from with a regulator, I'm with a bank, I'm with a crypto company, all over the place, because I think that's where a lot of regulation is actually going to wind up landing once people in policy roles really understand what's at stake here correctly and get past some of the sort of hypey business that we're in the current moment around. But also, I love the people I'm working with, and it just seemed like a good extension. When you think about decentralization, something I've cared about a lot for a long time, disintermediation, you have to think about things like open weights, and you have to think about the standards around, again, how these models are going to be held accountable ultimately. So that's really what I would say my focus is on. Not currently doing active policy work, but when people are out here in the Bay, I get called, and as Justin knows,
it's impossible to avoid.
That's exactly right. You can't.
If I can just realize for a moment,
Sheila, knowledge.
Totemic for sure. And Sheila, your resume, as far as how many boards are listed, reminds me a bit of like Tom Hanks' IMDb page, right? I remember I actually years ago I either interviewed you, wrote a piece in CoinDesk, and I had to like pithily summarize your titles. And so my editor, it can't be pithy. There's too much. There's still many important titles. So it's a pleasure to have you on the pod today.
Thanks. Sums up as professional flunner. Okay. I'm like a little over here. I'm a little over here. Like, I have a lot of interest. What can I say? But there's a through line. All
right. Art, how about yourself, sir?
So I'm Art. I'm the managing director of the Vana Foundation. I came to this problem when I was studying at Harvard and met my co-founder at MIT, thinking through what should the data economy look like. Data is the fuel that goes into AI. And that was before all of this AI boom kind of happened. And so over the last few years, we've just been seeing AI increasingly getting into the faces of people, and increasingly the question around how that should happen or how people should interface with that, how society should interface with that, is something that's fascinating to me. I actually studied public policy, although I'm not, like Sheila, actively in policy right now. I guess I could call my work applied policy.
I love it.
But I'm currently formulating a thesis around how do we unlearn to be machines? Because I think that for a long time, we've been extensions of machines, and AI has really brought that into the fore. So I'm doing a lot of thinking around that. And then what does that mean from a policy perspective in terms of how do we educate ourselves and the next generation of people to properly integrate this new technological shift? Doing that in my work, but I'm also doing a lot of thought, just thinking around that right now.
Awesome. And Justin.
So I'm Justin Slaughter. I am at Paradigm, which is a frontier venture capital firm, and of course led a round for Vana back in 2022. We're very happy to have the privilege of working with Art and Anna. I have had a long career in the technology and financial regulation space. I was previously at the CFTC. About a decade ago, I worked for Ed Markey as general counsel in the Senate on a variety of issues, and he, of course, co-authored the Telecommunications Act 96. And then I was at the SEC, started the Biden admin. For me, what I'm really focused on right now is this is a moment of tremendous flux and openness. Sheila mentioned that this is a field that really touches on so many other areas. I approach it almost identically, which is that we are rapidly moving to a point, I think, where there's not a person alive that's not going to have a view on AI. And the views are changing rapidly. One thing I've been really focused on is looking at how opinion polling is changing on this topic. And there's been tremendous swings over the last 6 months in terms of how at least Americans view AI. And sadly, it's mostly to the negative. We are seeing, before even there is a real uptake of the technology, already a backlash forming, which I think is going to be
less
very
popular
bad
than
for
Congress,
regulation.
according to some surveys I've seen,
It's
right? Which is
striking.
really saying something.
And
yes.
it's one of those things where it's not just the negativity, it's the rapid swing of it. I did a poll we can get into in the winter, it was in February, and people were pretty pro AI back then, and that's just swung massively to the negative since then.
All right. So Justin, since you mentioned opinions and strong thoughts, let's start right away with an obvious topic where many Americans have very strong thoughts, which involve protests and moratoriums and lightning rod issues. And that, of course, is data centers. And Sheila, I'd actually like to start with a take you had kind of off mic earlier or over email, technically, about in some ways, data centers is sneakily an insight into like the federal versus state versus local question, and a question of who should be regulating AI and when do these topics even get into the mainstream, and who's focused on it at the right time. We'd love to hear you expound upon that theory of yours.
Yeah, well, I think the thing to remember that's remarkable is that there has been legislation or proposed legislation in the AI space, like writ large, for many years now, and that is, as you point out, in the area of data centers. And the thing to note is that data center policy wasn't about AI, right? It really was about a lot of other things: environment, energy, noise, YIMBY versus NIMBY. Like, it kind of caught this moment where it was catching the wave of a lot of other trends and things that were happening that were really tech adjacent or to some extent outside of tech. And so the story I was telling the group was that in 2024, so I always tell everybody in Washington, the most important conference you can attend, the most important ones are not in Washington, they are outside of Washington. And there's one called the National Conference on State Legislators. It happens every August, NCSL. And that is where every state legislator shows up there until you really get a pulse check walking around the building of what people care about. Okay. So we had pitched a data center session then, and we did one on mining. At the time, it was really about Bitcoin mining, but we were kind of framing it more as like data centers more generally. And it was so oversubscribed. They had like double overflow. It went like 30 minutes long. And they were like waving it. Like, they have, I was the moderator. They had all those like signs, like 1 minute, 10 minutes, or like minus 100 minutes or whatever. And I was like, I'm sorry, one job, because people really cared, but they were not even connecting it to AI. It was pre-AI. Nobody was talking about that, right? It was just, what does this mean for my community? Is it going to create jobs or not? Is it going to destroy the water supply or not? Is it going to be loud or not? Is it going to be, what is it going to be diverting? And what is the opportunity cost for having these in my backyard, as it were? And so I just found that fascinating. And when I went back to Washington, this is, of course, remember, this is like the run up to the midterms. Okay. So you would think that what's happening on the ground would be of paramount importance and top of mind on the campaign trail. And it really wasn't, even though I can tell you, my team clocked from 48 of the 50 states. We had people in that room interested in the topic. So,
and Justin, you alluded to earlier that new data and new polling and what that shows. Can you share what you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, basically what's going on is that there has been a rapid swing to the negative, as I mentioned. So Gallup did a poll that just dropped about a week ago, and they have been polling this issue every year for the last 3 to 4 years. What you're seeing is, and this is just, I think, really sad, the Americans now, about 52% think AI will do equal amounts of harm and good, which is about where it was in 2023. But while in 2024, only 30% said more harm than good, and about 12% said more good than harm, now we're at 40% more harm than good and 9% more good than harm. So as the technology's gotten greater penetration into the economy, as people are using it more, views of it are worsening. And what really scares me the most is usually the way you see technology emerge is it starts with first adopters, which are overwhelmingly young people, and it spreads over time up the age spectrum. This was true for the telephone, it was true for radio, true for video games, true for crypto. What we're seeing in AI, ATMs too, what we're seeing in AI is some of the worst views of AI are among the young. The people who should be the early adopters are the ones who are most negative. So like, here's a great stat. Among adults age 18 to 29, and again, these are people then who are not, wedded to a current past paradigm of how the economy works. The percentage that says they've had at least some trust in the AI usage by businesses has fallen from 30% to 20% in the last year. While the percentage that says they have no trust at all, zero, has gone from 29 to 41%. This should not be happening. What should be happening is that people who are adopting it more and more start to get more comfortable with it, and we're just not seeing that at all. That
Justin,
is, to me, a fireball of the night.
Yeah. Do you have any sense of to what extent data center frustration and outrage is driving those numbers?
I mean, ironically, I think the data center thing is a red herring because there is a lot of evidence that they're very unpopular. Data centers have gone from being slightly more in favor of having people having a data center within a few miles where they live in January to now negative. I think the problem is jobs. Every indication I've got is that young people are hearing the message from some in the industry saying this is going to destroy the job market, and they are taking that with great sincerity. And the basic issue is, if you're a young person, rather than seeing how AI can supercharge your career and give you more agency, they see it as stripping it away from them, which in some ways I think is the opposite of what's intended, but that's how you get backlashes. People will pick up on messages that you did not intend, and things can get out of control very fast.
Art, even in the space for a while, what do you make of this backlash that Justin's referring to? I guess let's start with data centers and then the wider lens of AI writ large.
It's interesting because when I think about because I was part of some of the data collection teams that developed some of the AI technology that we don't even think about as AI. Like Google search is effectively algorithmic. We have the algorithmic feed, and there's a lot of stuff that for many years we were just like, yep, that's fine. And it tended to have neutral or positive. People had neutral or positive views in relation to AI before it became AI. I think that Justin is pointing out, and I agree, that there's seemingly a movement away from AI as it's coming out today and as people are encountering it in their lives today, whether that's through the lens of it's going to replace my job or the lens of there's a data center in my backyard and it's ruined everything around me. But I think fundamentally, tech has a really bad PR problem today.
Yeah.
And people are really, really unhappy with some of the leaders and some of the things that they're saying. Like I'm a millennial. I'm on Instagram all the time, and I'm always bombarded with these accounts of like crazy things that tech people say. When 5 years ago, that would have kind of been cute, kind of like, oh, how cool. Like this person is cutting edge. They're thinking differently. Now people are like, I'm sick of these weirdos. And I think we need to really acknowledge that as one of the problems that's driving maybe some of this anger or some of this distrust towards AI, because I almost think that AI is just I don't really like these folks kind of
I
outlet.
totally agree with you, Art. I just totally agree.
I think it's partly that, but I'll say it's even a step deeper. One thing that we don't appreciate in tech is how we are ourselves the vanguard. According to a poll, I think in March, the percentage of Americans that use Claude was about 3%. Most people have used AI through Gemini, through basically Google search, as Art mentions, or through Facebook, through Meta. I don't think many people have actually used AI in the way that's most powerful. So they're seeing all the negativity, which is, this is something that I don't see the value of necessarily. This is better search. They're not coding their own websites. They're not starting their own businesses, but then they're being told this is going to put you out of business. So much of this comes to an idea that I think the comms problem is real. We are talking about what the technology does and not what it does for people. This makes everybody a better version of themselves. I think that is a scary concept for a lot of people. But if you pitch it as this is helping you rather than replacing you, I think you get a very different response.
Justin, I 1000% agree. When I speak on AI conferences, my keynote is literally called AI to Empower, Not Eliminate, all about kind of human first, doing more. Totally agree. But I am wondering how much these two issues are kind of intertwined, of the optics question of AI, but also the policy and how it should be regulated, right? And I think that one reason some people are upset is a sense that there's no regulation at all. And what the hell? This is really scary tech to many. We have no sense of guardrails. So I'd love to hear from you guys. I'm going to ask an absurdly, almost over the top, cartoonishly open question of how should AI be regulated? What's your not an actual 17-point plan, but what's your North Star of a framework? Justin,
I'm gonna.
Sheila, you're chopping.
I'm gonna give those two a minute. Those two have a million thoughts, so I'm gonna give them a chance to consolidate their thinking to give you not a 17-point plan, but because I want to respond to some of the stuff that came before, and then I'll give you a very quick and then I'll open the floor to these two. I think that the comms problem is rooted in context. Okay, and the context we're in right now, we are in a time of outrageous dehumanization. We're in a time when our political leaders, the loudest political leaders, are engaged in massive dehumanization through practices in areas as robust from DOGE all the way to immigration policy to the economy and whatever it is. Okay, there does not seem to be consideration of actual people's lives, and a lot of the rhetoric, leave aside the policy, the rhetoric coming out of very senior political leadership. Tech leadership is encapsulated by a couple of folks, one, of whom announced he was going to give $100 million to the Republican Party, not helpful, to the cause of humanization, who similarly is not talking about humans and human beings and human lives in any meaningful way. And there's a dehumanization people do experience through their everyday, ordinary interaction with AI, which for most people, by the way, is actually through service chatbots. When I call my doctor's office, it is the most irritating. I hate it. If you hated what is it? Agent, if you operator, whatever, it's worse now. Okay. Whatever they're naming the thing, I'm like, oh my God, people hate it. That is their experience with AI. It's not what they're doing online and Gemini popping up some suggestions. That's the experience. Nobody likes it. So when that's your experience and you're like, I just want to talk to a person, you feel this contextual dehumanization coming at you, and you blame the most visible people who have the loudest platforms right now, who unfortunately do not reflect or represent the vast majority of builders or investors or anybody in this space. So in terms of policy, right? I think policy that talks about people in some meaningful way, and I'm just being very vague to get broad rather, but I think that is critically important. You can talk about safety, you can talk about open weights, you can talk about models, you can talk about competition, all these different things. But if that policy is not discussed in a frame that is about human lives, human flourishing, whatever you want to call it, I think it's just going to be unpopular, even if its benefit is to positive, it's going to make a positive difference in people's lives. Even if that is factually true, that message is going to get lost.
Sheila, I love that context. I also love they're already dancing on the third rail of like left versus right politics. And we're going to go there. I know it's fantastic. And I think later on we'll be discussing to what extent will AI become a party issue? Will there be is that going to be, how will it be affected midterms, right? So we'll definitely go there. So I love that. I appreciate that perspective. Arts, what are your thoughts on your,
I have many thoughts. So I did a bit of research on how AI is being regulated and what the policies are in relation to AI. And it was really surprising to me that, and this is building on something that Sheila said, the number one, the most proliferous, I don't even know if that's a word, the most common law that exists in relation to AI is in relation to deepfakes, because that's something visceral. People feel that. And it's easy for people to interact with that and say that that's completely wrong. We saw that when Grok decided to generate, what it was like a nude image of a woman every 30 seconds was at the peak of Grok when it was released. People hate that, and that's why that stuff moves forward. But AI affects us in so many different ways. There's algorithmic bias, there's ways that AI is used to select. And the most important thing, and Justin kind of mentioned this earlier, is that in addition to interacting with AI on support calls, the other place where the people are interacting with AI is in their workplaces, where somebody from the top down is saying, implement AI, do something with AI. And that for a lot of people is really not the way you want to interact with the new technology. And, the diffusion model, technology diffusion model has never been about somebody top down saying, use this. But again, this is a weird adoption curve that we're on with AI. And I think it's to do with a lot of societal and macroeconomic factors as to why it's coming through that way. In terms of policy in this space, one thing that I would add is, I'm sure everyone on this call has felt it. As policy people who work in tech, sometimes we have to translate to our tech friends that the ethos of move fast and break things is not the way that policy can be made. You can't just move fast and break things with people's lives. And I think that's where the disconnect is when we have a lot of leaders in the tech space who've grown up with, and I've no ill will towards them, but they've grown up around a culture of move fast and break things. And then they rock up to DC and they're like, why can't I just move fast and break things? Yeah. And I think potentially that's the barrier of getting any coherent AI policy that matches technology through the door, day dot. My idea for how we should regulate AI, and this is I've been laughed at for having this idea, and I will say it, it's a utility. It's potentially monopolized infrastructure. There are economic studies around how AI could be akin to something like regulated industries, regulated monopolies, and that could be the optimal amount of AI that we want in society. We're talking about optimal technology. I threw this out there. I've thrown this out there several times, but I do think that there is a way to look at AI as a public good and regulated like a utility because of the nature of what it is. That's really unpopular on many sides of the spectrum. I'm probably not going to get some supporters on the business side or the government side, but I do think that we got to think about a different way to regulate this thing.
Or we can have a 2-hour convo just on the merits of AI as a utility. That's a fascinating concept. But Justin, I want to hear your 17-point plan. What is? Give us the bullets.
I mean, I'll give you 4. So the first step with regulating is to start. The basic problem the US has is we can't do piecemeal regulations that the Europeans do. The Europeans have already done their AI Act, which includes, I think it goes live this week, requirement that when there is information or videos created by AI that are fake, you've got to say in a watermark, this is created by AI. So what needs to happen, I think, is 4 things. First, the number one thing to do is triage. The thing that makes me the most scared right now are events like the Hugging Face event, which we didn't get information about for days into weeks. There should be a requirement, like we have in most other parts of the economy, that when there is a major data breach that involves either a risk to a company or a risk to a significant number of users, that needs to be disclosed to the public, and it needs to be disclosed, more importantly, to regulators. That's the first step. I think that helps also create control, or at least a feeling things are not out of control, and thereby creates the space then for additional work. The second is much, I think, more straightforward. The easy thing to always do with a new technology is protect the kids first. It's kind of like what you do in a crisis or in a burning building. Right now, I think there is a broad agreement that how we treat adult usage of AI is different than that of how we treat kids. There's a very simple reason. Kids don't have full rights to speech and to the usual constitutional rights that all Americans have. Why? Because they're kids. My kids complain with us all the time. Why is it they can't access Twitter or Facebook? I'm like, because I'm your dad. You're a minor. It's my rules. I think finding ways to help parents be empowered to protect their kids and reduce the ability of kids to use these systems easily would go a long way. The third way is in some ways the most easy. So far, I have seen very little in the way of policymakers actually using AI. There was a great interview that Jasmine's son did with Senate candidate Abdul El Sayed. It released today. He's running for Senate in Michigan. The polls close there in like 2 hours after we record this. The Kalshi odds say he's going to win by smacking double digits. But he said something very interesting, which is he does not see why, he doesn't talk about why he doesn't like data centers, does not see why we would allow data centers for something that doesn't have any use itself. There's not much use out of AI. I keep seeing evidence of a lot of members of Congress, with the exception, ironically, of one Bernie Sanders, who don't use AI themselves. Charlotte Swayze, a very talented woman at Searchlight Institute, did analysis of campaigns. As of her analysis in March, no campaigns on the Democratic side, I think one on the Republican, have a Claude subscription. So what we need to do to get better regulation is get the policymakers actually using AI daily. I've been saying this for a while, that like, if you're a member of Congress or a staffer, that you are actually someone who could probably use this very well for better responses to your constituents, better questions asked in a hearing, better memo writing, right? It's hard to get good regulation until the regulators themselves are not facile with the technology. And the fourth thing, the hardest thing, is going to be figuring out what to do about the core issue, which is not data centers, but is export of chips. I think in many ways, the US can at least agree that the biggest issues in the short term are going to be how you allow American chips with all their NatSec implications to be exported overseas. And in part because if you restrict that, as I think you probably should to some extent personally, you probably reduce the risk of a rapid race between countries that would destroy all possibility of regulation.
So on that, and it's a really crisp, I'll kidding aside, Justin, it's a really lucid, crisp list hitting key topics. And I'm glad you mentioned the exports. I think a related topic is the question of open source and the China question right now. We've seen in the last week or two, it's become insanely topical. Chinese open models went from, by my accounts, 1% to 15% of the market roughly. And last year, obviously much cheaper. How much should that scare the US? And there's kind of a paradox here of, do we kind of can gate our own closed models, but you can't gate the open weights. So to what extent does a crackdown make sense? Is that, how are, Justin, kick us off here. How are you thinking about I mean, frankly, pretty challenging, tricky question of how to handle open source models?
I think this is really important because if you fall into the trap of being pro or anti open source, you're never going to get there. I don't think anybody's against the idea of open source. I love open source.
Yeah.
The question is going to be, in many ways, how do you make sure that there is a space for open source, but at the same time, that does not mean we can have no regulation either. I tend to think this is where Art's point about networks and utilities makes sense. We don't have a system in utilities of having true open source access. If we do, it's off of government agencies or various public-private partnerships. What's probably the right move is underscoring that there is a right to have open source models, but also to make clear that that is not a get out of jail free. Open source in pure coding is absolutely a protected right, in my opinion. It's like speech. At the same time, it is also true that there is restrictions in how you can, put out the plans for, say, making a bomb. So what you probably want to do there is focus primarily on the hard edge cases rather than get into a philosophical core debate about what is better, open source or not open source. I personally think this is an area where we'll probably get an answer from the markets for anything else. Is the question on AI something? You first, sorry.
Well, no, I was curious of Sheila, your perspective and advanced AI society perspective on this. Obviously, open source undergirds a lot of what the advanced AI society is doing. How are you thinking about the open source question with respect to policy?
And so here I'm speaking just for myself, so I want to be really clear about that, right? Because I think it's a big discussion. Because I agree with Justin completely. I think open source versus closed, it's a bit of a red herring conversation because it's not truly. You can't in the AI context, you can't really capture it. And again, here I think we are sophisticated on this podcast, and the listeners are as well, which is we understand AI as eventually being able to self-determine. Okay. Whereas most people who are regulating are thinking of AI as just another technology that always has some kind of controls around it de facto because you can pull a plug somewhere, right? It's kind of how someone phrased it to me in Washington once. We are looking at a model where, and it's provable. I mean, we just the latest with Kimmy and everything, we know that is not true. Like an AI that really is operating is going to have this ability to self-determine and to kind of grow and infiltrate, if you want to use a sort of a word with connotation, pretty quickly, and that's happening in real time. So open source versus not is kind of an interesting question because what you're really talking about is what are we allowing access to and what are we not, and how are we requiring different companies or different corporate structure boundaries to create walls and that are protective. I think that's kind of what the real conversation is about when it comes to industrial competition, right? And so you saw very quickly out here in the Valley, you saw folks lining up, and so when you look at the coalition that came together at the end of last month. And again, I was in Europe, so I was kind of like following it from the European reporting perspective. Very interesting, by the way. Who didn't you see there? Well, you didn't see the folks that really have the most to lose competitively, right? The ones that already have a moat, that already have, are kind of like off to the races, and everyone else is really, if we're honest, kind of playing catch up here. So it's hard to separate, I think, I'll call it the lowercase p politics of this and the sort of competition that you're seeing out in the Valley, and the fact that the sophistication of these actors is so advanced compared to that of any policymaker and even of most users to even understand the context here. So like I say, I think it's a bit of a red herring to talk about this as an open source versus not discussion. The other thing I'll say to get to kind of address Art's utility concept, which is very intriguing, is that digital public infrastructure, or DPI, as a frame, and we've talked about this a lot, Art, you and I, not so successful in many places unless you had a very top-down government, mandate to use something like in India with UPI, for example, right? Without that sort of mandate and the elimination of alternatives, you don't have the uptake that you need to make that competitive. And so I think the utility argument, which I would love to spend a little time on if we have the time, is interesting because there you're not saying it has to be competitive. You are talking a little bit, I assume, Art, about a bit of a government oligopoly on things, right? Because there has to be that stamp before anybody could operate. But you're also saying that the purest base layer of whatever the basic thing you need is the thing that is the utility, and everything else on top of that presumably would not be. And again, that's a model where to get there in terms of policy, you'd have to jump right into the fray of this entire discussion out here in the Valley of who gets to win. And suddenly you're saying none of you, right? Yeah. Or at least the advantages you have now suddenly get wiped out. And I don't know how that would ever play. So, but you addressed that too, I think, when you talked about...
I think that's the problem. Like that, in an ideal world, like we look at internet proliferation, for example. We at least in places where we are right now, we're like, oh, yep, that's just at this point a utility for us. Like we pay an internet bill, we get.
Basically.
For a lot of people in the world, internet access is still not a thing. And why? Because they don't treat it in the same way that we do. So I think the transition towards that is definitely going to be something we can unpack. I've had a lot of thinking about this in terms of what the ideal model is, but then how we get there is just, it's a mess. One thing about open source that I do want to flag here is that, and I think this is where we get tripped up when we think about open source models, because there are, one could argue, and I don't have any experience in this, that the dark web is open source because there are no regulators. People are openly contributing to open code where there's no one around. At the same time, a lot of the work that we do in standards, IP addresses, ISPs, that's all open source work. So there's like open source that's trustworthy and in the light, and there's open source that's in the darkness. And I think that when
light open, dark open,
white market, black market,
yeah, 2x2, great on visualizing.
Kind of, and I feel like that's why people feel so uncomfortable with open source conversations relating to models coming out of China, because they've not historically been part of a conversation around building open frameworks in that way, and there are some negative associations, connotations to models like Quen and Kimi and on all of those models that are coming out. And so it comes down to me, for me, it comes down to trust. Because, and this is where I think we're at a somewhat of a tipping point in society where this is a very messy question. Jeff, you started the question with something along the lines of like our models versus open source models. But when we think about
not our, I guess more like US closed models versus open. I have no personal allegiance here, right? This is just
of course. But when you think about US models, whose models are they? They're not the US people's models. The US people don't have AI models. They're specific companies, private companies' models. And we discussed earlier today that we have a trust problem with them. And so as somebody who plays in the realm of, I use Claude, I have Claude Suite, I also run open source stack. I'm always thinking about it's something that's actually very visceral to my everyday is do I run this in my open source stack or do I run this in a Claude model? And it comes down to trust. And it's crazy for me to think wait a minute, do I trust this unlabeled open source thing that I'm not sure whether it's in the darkness or in the light? Or do I trust a company that is part of a group of people that is starting to lose faith and trust in our society? And that's why this is such a hairy problem for a lot of practitioners implementing open source technology. We don't have enough trust right now. And I think standards bodies, the decentralized community, the work that Sheila's doing at Advanced AI, I think it's super important right now because we do need to build that trust.
Totally agree. And I think it's a really, the paradox is real. I mean, just to put my cards on the table, literally the title of this podcast is The People's AI, right? So I am spiritually, I am rooting for open source solutions. Yet also every day I'm using Claude and ChatGPT, and I'm also not blind to the very tricky policy questions and risk questions, geopolitics questions. Those are all real too, right? I don't pretend to have any easy solutions. It is really tough. Justin, you want to chime in? Then I had a quick question for Art. Go ahead, Justin.
Yeah, I think this is one thing where I really struggle, where I want to distinguish between the American people's AI and the American government's AI. So in China, they have a lot of open source models, but I would not call any of them the Chinese people's models. I think they are, as with most things in China, a somewhat derivative / composite of a business and then the official government of the state, which then makes me not trust some of those models. As a liberal, I'm always afraid of any one person becoming too powerful. It's very true for AI. I would not want a world. I don't think even a lot of the AI companies want a world where one company is so dominant it has hegemony over the entire globe.
Yeah.
Art's question, but I believe that. Men are angels.
I don't think they're monolithic within any of these companies either.
To me, the goal should be to make sure that AI is something that is truly not controlled by anyone at its frontier, or alternatively, that you have to use one system. There's this great line I think about a lot from, I think it was the Roman philosopher Juvenal, which was who guards the guardians. I butcher the Latin. The question we should be asking in some ways is how do we make sure that the people have oversight over AI and not that an individual government, which may or may not reflect all the best interests of the people, have that control. It's why I get nervous. People say, let's have a government controlled AI. EU's talked about, trying to create some version of that. I don't want that either, because I think that probably creates a risk of tyranny from the government. So these are a lot of hard questions. And I worry the biggest problem is things are moving so fast, we don't have time to figure out how to answer them, which makes everything that much harder.
Well, I think, Justin, that's why I really liked where you started in your 4-point plan. And I would characterize your first bullet as what I think is of paramount importance, and it's easy to do quickly, which is just transparency, like really understanding to what extent people are leveraging which kind of model. No one even understands that. People, I don't think that most casual users of AI, and again, we've identified, you already said, 3% of Americans, I think you said, have used Claude to begin with. Okay, so even among that 3%, I don't think most of them really understand what open source is. Like, I don't think they understand that there are alternatives. They don't think they get it. And so I even think some basic disclosure regime that creates transparency, you can't have accountability without transparency, right? That's like step one. And if you want to create any sort of accountability mechanism down the line around harms, because I think the other contextual piece we should bring in here is that we're at a time when people think about the internet, there's mostly the talk is about harm. Okay, you're seeing a barrage of lawsuits that are coming forth with social media. Those are all about harm, and mostly harm to kids, but also harm to families. And so a lot of the conversation with AI and even AI safety, which means different things to different people. Again, like none of these terms have crisp definitions yet, or maybe ever. It's really about harm mitigation. Okay, and so when you're in that model and people, and then you get into this conversation about open source, people are like, well, how is that going to help me not be hurt? Right. And so the answer to that, of course, is, well, if something is open, then yes, the bad guys can do things with it, but the good guys can also do things with it. And you can have more, good guys doing things and trying to combat bad guys, because you can create communities around this. And that's the obvious. And anybody in open source will tell you that's the answer. But it doesn't really address, from a policy perspective, what people are really talking about. So I want to go back just really quickly to that data center discussion that we started with, right? Because the takeaway from that conversation shouldn't be data centers were so important, and that was a harbinger, the canary in the coal mine, that AI policy was coming, people are going to be anti-AI. I don't think that's the takeaway. The takeaway is that what people cared about was their water, their jobs, their house, their energy. Like that's what they cared about, right? And so they were not thinking about AI. It was sort of like a asterisk on the conversation, because it was about much more immediate need. And so when I think we talk about any internet related policy, we have to address that people right now are thinking about it. And the starting point of the conversation is harm and harm mitigation, right? So how is this conversation going to help me as a casual user, or somebody who doesn't even use AI but knows it's coming from me because I'm told that? How is this going to make a difference? That I think is important if you're going to put a policy lens on that conversation.
I think it's a crucial point to actually make it land and stick with the average citizen out there who's not in the weeds like we are. I do want to pivot to U.S. politics and the midterms and all that good stuff. But before we do, real quick, one thread I think that we've all been kind of teasing out in different ways is a question of who owns AI. It's a question we've just discussed a lot on this podcast, People's AI, and Art, better than anyone. A lot of what this is about is kind of who owns your data and the question of user data, right? And Art, do you have any thoughts on, throughout the season of this podcast, it's been a lot of exploration, talking to experts on legally who owns data and how, even though data is powering AI, often the contributors of those data are not getting compensated for it. Covered that a lot, but there's still not real consensus at a policy level about data ownership. Art, do you have any thoughts on that, or anyone, open jump ball for anyone of policy or regulation on question of data ownership and user ownership of AI?
I mean, I've always held this, and I will probably say this to the day that I die, that I think that if you've created the thing, you should own it. If it's your work, if you've created the data, you should own it, and you should own the values, the value accrual associated with it, and you should be able to participate in that in an economy where you are given a fair exchange of that value. That's not the way the data economies are currently built, and I understand that. I think, situating this in amongst a policy argument, the problem is that we've seen decades of economic growth based on a primitive of non-data ownership. So it's another one of those sticky transition moments. And I think that's kind of why we're at this moment of thinking like, oh, who owns AI? I mean, if we had proper data primitives when big data was starting to come to the fore, we may not be even having these arguments about who owns AI models, because it would be pretty clear that people whose data contributed to the AI models and whose work contributed to the AI models would properly own those models, and companies would have to do things differently. So I think, yes, the philosophy and what we're trying to advocate for is a new system around that. But I think the transition is going to be challenging. And I do think that ownership of AI models is a critical question here, because ownership almost precedes trust.
Thank you for that. Sheila, and again, each of these topics could be like 3 hours over multiple glasses of wine in more detail. But let's get to U.S. politics and how AI could impact the midterms. Will it be an issue? I think, just to state the obvious, it is wild to me that in some sense we have a topic where you have like Bernie Bros and Steve Bannon like on the same page at times, which is wild. Then again, it also, I'm wondering, will this shake out ultimately among traditional party lines of the left being anti-AI, rights, or a big chunk of the right being pro-AI? Sheila, how do you see this situation shaking out?
So I'm going to say something, radical in some circles, which is I just don't think anybody should be campaigning for or against AI. I just don't think it makes any sense. And again, I'll go back to, what do people actually care about right now? And AI is still a bit abstract to people. Now, there are some districts where it obviously matters. If you're out in the Valley, if you're maybe in certain districts in New York, I mean, I think it really, really matters. And I think having a somewhat generic point of view is probably important, right? And you have to base that on whatever your constituency, what their general trends towards, innovation or not, or whatever tend to be. I think that's kind of as far as I would go if I were not a tech savvy or known for being a tech savvy kind of politician. And there are some of those folks, of course, that exist. I think that you have to, again, have it's like a follow-on. So you have to have a position on jobs. Okay. So then you have an ancillary position on AI, but your core position is jobs. Right? Your core position is inflation. Okay, then how do you think about AI with respect to that? Your core issue is trade. How do you think about AI with respect to that? Your core issue is the defense budget. How do you think about it? So it's kind of like, what are your main things you are known for that your constituents care about? And then you have like the AI version of that thing. But I actually think if I were I actually do get calls all the time, but I don't think anybody should be campaigning on like, I am the pro-AI candidate. I am the anti-AI candidate. By the way, any more than I ever really thought anyone should be campaigning as the pro-crypto or anti-crypto candidate. I think it's similarly silly because, again, when you look at people's fears, they're not related to actual use of AI, as Justin articulated in that polling data, right? They have concerns, but the concerns are, again, they're usually about something else, and they're pulling AI in as a boogeyman. In some cases, they don't really understand what's going on, or in some cases, they have a very real reason to have that fear.
The cynic in me will just quickly push back or steelman or response here in the sense that intellectually that all makes sense, but also people don't understand things all the time and use boogeymans, right? And so I could totally see some demagogue wanting to campaign on like, oh, people hate AI. Guess what? I'm the anti-AI guy, right? And I could see a candidate in the midterms, or hell, even the presidential election, campaign hard on anti-AI because that's a very popular issue.
I would say that is because that person is prone to being a fear-mongering candidate, and AI
Agreed.
might be the most currently relevant thing to fear-monger around, or maybe it's immigrants, or maybe it's, war, or maybe it's like, who the hell knows what it is, right? But there are some people who are, I would argue, terrible people who are going to generate fear as a reason to propel them into office. And if that happens to time out with where you are in the campaign cycle in your particular district, hey, we're going to see it. But I think it is, in general, I don't think that is I don't think it has legs. And I think especially if you're somebody who's running and you're a newer candidate and you're not known, you haven't been around for like, a million years, right? Like some of these folks, you don't have an established brand already. I think branding yourself as an anti-AI, for that matter, pro-AI person is going to have a short-term, it's going to have a high failure rate over kind of the long-term, situation. And look, let's be real.
Sure.
I think for politicians, their number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 job, and I don't mean to be cynical about this, I really think most people get into politics to make change and to benefit their constituents. But you can't do that if you don't get elected, right? And if you're looking at that as a long-term thing, you need to have a stable and a core focus of issues that's going to take you over the next, 20 years, not just be hyper responsive to the immediate present tense.
Justin, what's your take on the intersection of policy? Yeah.
So it's interesting. If a member came to me and said, I am a total sociopath, I just want to win and I don't care about what that involves at all, I would probably say to them, well, you probably do want to say you're maximally anti-data center. But I then would say to them, but you're intending on not just winning this one election, right? You would like to win re-election. You're running for Congress. Maybe you want to be a senator or president. You want something that actually you can follow through on. Someone who says, I'm going to ban AI and then can't ban it will either look weak or corrupt. So what I would tell an actual member is that, like, if you want a blueprint for what to do, I would be looking at something like the campaigns of an Alex Borres in New York, who didn't win, but did a pretty good job actually being tough on AI, but actually also understanding it, or some examples of various people out in the West. The goal should be figuring out, I think, how to say you understand this and are cognizant of people's fears without, to Sheila's point, saying you're anti it as a whole. That's very hard in primaries, but primary season's ending. If I were to design a policy in a box, I would be like, I support the right for all my constituents in their cities and townships to have the right to have an AI data center or to not, and to have basic protections for them. You don't have to lay out your full 40-point plan running for Congress. In the past, when I've advised campaigns, I've often told them, don't make this complicated. Long plans are for governing. You'll get there in January. For now, come up with a vision. And I think that is the number one thing I would probably be telling people thinking running for office nationally, is that you're going to need to explain to people who are very nervous how you as president will actually help them, and not in a way that you are trapped by your own words. It's very hard for anybody, politicians especially, to think more than a few months down the road, but that's probably the best thing to do, which is important because this is changing so fast. It is probably the case, right, that in 15 months, when we're really in the teeth of the 28 primary season, we'll have had a new model at both of Claude and of ChatGPT that is better than Fable, with all new problems to solve from that. Kimi will probably be also at an even higher level of open source capabilities. Anyone who thinks they just need to come up with something right now, which some members of Congress think do, they just need to solve it right now, is kidding themselves. This is a long marathon, a grueling ultra marathon even, that gets harder as we go, not easier. And that is the mindset I would want them to take on.
Wise words. I'm very sad we're almost out of time. Art will give you the quick last word on this question. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, as the international in the room, I've always held the privileged position of being at policy school in the United States and not having my skin in the game in US politics. One thing that I'll observe is I think that the sensible approach is exactly what Justin and Sheila have set out. My fear or question, more question, is I've seen, especially in recent years, that in the United States, politicians aren't really held to account for track records on things as well as they were previously. And I wonder whether that's actually breeding ground for somebody to go out hard on something like AI and then reverse policy later on and have no repercussions associated with it. And that's the only thing that I'm concerned about here, where it's like the emotions of the people will guide truth versus somebody's actual track record on things. And it's the cult of personality that's going to lead that. If I was a purely mercenary political advisor on this issue, I would say go hard, because I'm not sure you'll be held to account on it later on.
Well, that's
But
so
that's my
depressing.
controversy.
I think there's truth in all of this.
Can
I
we
love
end on-
Sheila's
can we end on a
ideals,
better
but I'm
note
too
than
cynical. I'm too cynical.
Sorry.
I mean, I can't say I can't. When you say it, I can't say I disagree. It's just so depressing.
I want to say something, which is that there's a great line from Winston Churchill that America will always be counted on to do the right thing after it's exhausted all other options. I think that's been true of how we've approached most parts of tech policy. I have that faith that we'll get there in AI too, but there will be bumps along the way.
It's so depressing, Art, because I it is a fair point that does anyone even have the attention span to track what someone said on the campaign trail? And so I'll use as a counterpoint, and then there's criticisms and praise to be made about this individual, but the Mamdani administration. So I was trying to quickly look up in the behind the scenes if he has a position on AI. I don't know that he does. I assume he does because most politicians of his stature do, but I think the reason that you're seeing so much interest is because he is, again, focusing on this through line of humanity. And like, what do people really want? They want soccer fields open all night. They want free buses. They want whatever it is that's going to be immediate improvements to people's lives. Mm. And there are people that are tracking that back to campaign promises. And he is doing a good PR job, I think, of like tying that to campaign promises. But that's all like extra work. I don't think people are like, I'm so happy the soccer fields are open because that was your campaign promise. They're like, that was just really cool and made me happy, right? So again, I think you can be a very successful politician and not have a widely known position on AI if he even has one to begin with, and maybe someone knows.
So
Justin,
this is interesting because I will break some news here. Mayor Mamdani was at a friend of mine and Sheila's in New York earlier this year. They asked him about kind of tech and what it can do. And his vision was entirely about how can AI help make government better, which is very useful and good, but I think speaks to its own element of myopia, which is that policymakers sometimes can fall into the trap of thinking the questions about how do we use something in government and not how do we deal with it in all facets of life, right? Mm-hmm. New York City is a city with a lot of post-industrial jobs. It no longer is a place with a lot of factories. By definition, in the current, usage of AI, there's a lot of ways you could see AI used to change how those jobs work. And the mayor is struggling actually with a request from most of the city council to pause AI usage inside the schools. I mean, so far, ironically, he's tried to kind of avoid this subject rather than lean into it. I think because it's so sticky and so problematic. It's very hard to take a stance on this in a way that doesn't, if you're doing it kind of in a earnest and good faith way, raise a lot of problems for your own allies. And this is going to be one of the obstacles to finding a way to regulate AI, is that if you are trying to tackle it in a sophisticated way, you're going to make some of your own friends angry, whether you're on the right or the left. And what we need are members of Congress with the courage to say, this is so important, I'm going to try and solve it, even though it's really hard, which, Kirsten Gillibrand and Cynthia Lummis did on crypto. Who is that member of AI that's going to do that? We've seen some initial actions from, I think, Lori Trahan and Overholt, I think, is the two members of Congress, the House, left and right. What we need now are more people willing to say, I want to be the member of Congress that actually finds a way to regulate this in a bipartisan, sustainable way.
Guys, this has been a fantastic conversation. I'm so glad that we assembled this crew. Really appreciate all these insights. Love the takes. Thanks so much again, guys. Really enjoyed it. Well, there you have it. Thank you again to today's guests, Sheila Warren, Art Abal, and Justin Slaughter. Thank you to our show's producer and video editor, Jasper Chua. Thank you to the show's researcher, Kate Morgan. Thank you to Bradford Craig for our theme music. And thank you to you, dear listener. If this is your first time at People's AI, subscribe, rate it 5 stars, all that good stuff. We'll be taking a brief break to kind of recharge the summer and be back before too long with season 5. Thanks again and see you then.